There's always history to the presidency. Um, a history lesson from one of America's most tragic presidents, James Garfield, is largely forgotten today, but he saved his unpopular party from disaster before tragedy struck him. Now, if you're a Democrat, you've probably been feeling cursed for a while. Every time it seems like things might get better for America, the world or both bad luck strikes, and the result is a massive setback. Yeah, usually by the Republicans. But just look at this decade. Joe Biden had won the 2020 presidential election with more votes than any other candidate in American history, but because Donald Trump refused to accept defeat, the moment was soured. Now Republicans are trying to strip away the voting rights, potentially empower their own partisans to overturn election results and otherwise render it difficult for Democrats to ever win national power ever again. And faced with Moscow Mitch's intransigence and a pair of Democratic senators, and well, actually, they call them Democratic senators, but they're closet Republicans, who refuse to dump the filibuster, even though that arcane procedure literally makes it impossible for their own party to govern. Biden has taken the blame for many of Republicans' mistakes, notably the bungled Afghanistan war that was started by George W. Bush and it was concluded by Trump, which Biden wrapped up with an admittedly ugly withdrawal. Now, Biden and the Democrats face the ominous prospect of entering 2022 and the 2024 elections as the unpopular incumbents, with historic precedent suggesting that they will likely lose the first of those and face a difficult path in the second. As a result, it was written about there was a story that was written back in the 1930s about the 1934 midterm elections, which may offer Democrats a more hopeful precedent this year. Imagine a favorable narrative a favorable narrative might for the 2024 election. It may be useful to consider a president best known for sharing his name with a grumpy cartoon cat who hated Mondays. Enter James Garfield, whose story resonates surprisingly well today. Now, Garfield's tale is about great potential needlessly squandered, notable crusades repeatedly frustrated, and the atrocious bad luck reflecting the most squalid and stupid of human foibles. In other words, it's a story that today's Democrats voters know very well and recognize. Garfield was literally born in a log cabin in rural Ohio in the month of November of 1831. He was raised by a single mother who was desperately so fucking poor that he faced relentless bullying as a child for it, and he sought escape through constant reading and writing. And he was determined to better himself, so he entered the workforce at 16 and held a number of odd jobs in his early adulthood. He worked as a canal worker, a carpenter, a janitor, and a teacher, and he worked his way through college and had a religious awakening. And surprisingly, Garfield is the only president who was actually ordained as a minister and was admitted to the bar. And those who knew him were struck by his intellect and how smart he was. He was fluent in Latin and Greek, and he was a talented public speaker, and he became well known for his esoteric academic pursuits. And perhaps the most famous of these was his discovery of the trapezoid proof for the Pythagorean theorem, which he pursued during his downtime while serving in Congress. And to his credit, Garfield was horrified by slavery, and he became a passionate abolitionist. It's kind of funny that he joined the Republican Party, which the Republican Party now sides with the KKK views. So that was kind of odd back then that he would join a party that sided with KKK. He joined the newly founded Republican Party that basically supports the KKK now, and the Republican Party back then was supposedly was against slavery. In 1860, when the Southern states seceded and launched a civil war rather than accept the election of Abraham Lincoln, Garfield immediately supported the Union cause. But while many of his contemporaries only fought to preserve the Union, Garfield made it clear that But while many of his contemporaries only fought to preserve the Union, Garfield made it clear that the true moral cause behind the war was to end slavery. As a newly elected Ohio State senator, he could have avoided military service, but Garfield resigned his office, and in 1861 he enlisted in the Army. He eventually rose to the rank of Major General and so impressed his contemporaries that in 1863 he was nominated to run for Congress from Ohio's 19th District. Now he won that seat and held it until his victory in 1880. And to this day, he remains the only sitting House member to ever be elected president. This was not the only unusual thing about Garfield's election, but based on normal circumstances of party politics, he shouldn't have been elected at all. Now, 3 presidents have entered office amid the more turbulent circumstances than Garfield's predecessor. Fellow Republican Rutherford Hayes, who was the official winner of the controversial 1876 election, in which the Republican Party blatantly cheated, Hayes carried the nickname his fraudulency until his dying day. He was only allowed to take office without accompanying the Second Civil War through the Compromise of 1877, which effectively ended the Reconstruction, withdrew all remaining federal troops from the former Confederate states, and it started the Jim Crow era of the brutal racist oppression and segregation. Otherwise, Hayes' term was largely forgettable. Rather than his handling of the Great Railroad Strike of 1877 and his inability to provide any material relief amid an economic downturn, the Republicans suffered massive defeats in the 1878 midterm election, losing control of the Senate and sustaining further losses in the House, which was then divided four ways with the Independent Democrats and the Greenback Party, as well as the official Democrats and Republicans. Somehow, just 2 years after that, another Republican won the presidential election, James Garfield, and how the fuck did he pull it off? First of all, the Republicans were deadlocked in choosing a nominee. Hayes kept his promise not to run for re-election, and the apparent frontrunner was the former President Ulysses S. Grant, who was seeking a third term after 4 years out of office, but he was challenged by two popular insurgents, Senator James G. Blaine of Maine and John Sherman, Hayes' Secretary of the Treasury. The party was split between the warring factions, the stalwarts who wanted a patronage system for party loyalists, and the half-breeds who backed the civil service reform, and there were also economic disagreements on tariff and currency policy, and the Republicans faced an obvious electoral disadvantage with black people in the South largely stripped of the right to vote. Now, Garfield entered the Republican convention as a Sherman supporter, but not a candidate. Now, describing the Ohio congressman as a dark horse, it would be an exaggeration. No one following the 1880 election thought he was even in the race, but yet in a scene worthy of the movies, Garfield changed that even with a half-improvised speech on behalf of his champion, one so well-received that convinced the delegates that he was the man that they'd been looking for, and one passage stood out. 25 years ago, this republic was bearing and wearing a triple chain of bondage. Long familiarity with traffic in the bodies and souls of men and it had paralyzed the consciousness of a majority of our people. The narrowing and disintegrating doctrine of the state sovereignty, it had shackled and weakened the noblest and most beneficent powers of the national government, and the grasping power of slavery was seizing upon the virgin territories of the West and dragging them into the den of eternal bondage. It is easy to imagine why this would have electrified the assembled delegates. Garfield went through the Republican Party's history, issue by issue, and cloaked their most cherished causes in the soaring moral rhetoric of a preacher. Now, he reminded Republicans of the party's highest ideals, which united them far more than the disputes between the Grant and Blaine factions divided them. His concluding argument was that delegates from both sides should join behind Sherman, yet as Garfield continued his speech, a contemporary reporter recalled, now, curious remarks were made about it. Those who were utterly were unable to recognize the Secretary of the Treasury and the ideal man whose portrait Garfield drew began to think that the picture was Garfield's picture of himself. Now, suggestions to this effect have been frequently made day to day by men who are in no way hostile to Garfield and who see the course that he has pursued during the convention indications of an honest desire to advance his own fortune. As the convention dragged on, the contemporaries later recalled Garfield's speech lingered in their memories. This unlikely moment and its outcome stands as a testament to the power of eloquence and charisma, and a reminder that the shape of history is not always decided by the cynical calculations of the powerful businesses and political interest. Now, literature in the 1880 election makes clear that if the delegates hadn't felt so stirred by Garfield's appeal to the better angels, they would have picked Grant, Blaine, and Sherman, or some other alternative. Instead, their inability to break the deadlock made the declared candidates look worse and worse, while Garfield looked better and better by comparison. Despite Garfield's strenuous objections, he insisted he was not a candidate and wanted Sherman to be president, but a stampede began in his favor and he became the nominee. But how did he go on to win the general election after that? Presidential candidates in that era did little active campaigning on their own, so Garfield's role was primarily about strategy rather than oratory. The Republicans who did two things right, which is highly impossible because they never do anything right, they repeatedly reminded the voters that their opponents were associated with the white supremacy and treason, and that they hit the Democrats on the bad economic policy as well. And to do the former, they brought up memories of the Civil War, slavery, and the brutal mistreatment of African Americans in the southern states. Democrats described this as waving the bloody shirt, but Republicans dismissed that criticism for what it was, an attempt to vilify them for telling the truth. The major pocket, which has hardly ever happened because the Republicans don't tell the truth, the major pocketbook issue was tariffs, and Republicans argued that the Democrats' incoherent tariff policy might lead to lost jobs. In the end, Garfield won the nomination, albeit by a razor-thin popular vote margin, which was less than 2,000 votes out of more than 9.2 million cast. His electoral victory was more decisive, 214 to 155, but his presidency began with big promises, including plans to clean up government, um, including his presidency began with big promises, including plans to clean up government and fund a universal system of public education. His only actual major achievement, however, was one Supreme Court appointment on July 2nd, 1881, after less than 4 months in office. Garfield was shot in the back at a Washington railroad station by a failed writer and a lawyer named Charles Gutow, who believed that the new president owed him a lucrative appointment. That wasn't the end of the story, though. The gunshot wound was relatively minor, and even in the 19th century, it was potentially survivable. But Garfield's doctors rejected the newfangled notion that they should wash their hands, and he apparently suffered a major infection as a result. And to this day, medical experts don't exactly agree what went wrong. But after a few weeks of apparent recovery, Garfield gradually declined, and he finally died on September 19th of 1881, 2.5 months after he was shot. If Garfield had survived, damn it. God damn it, hold on. God damn it. Now, if Garfield had survived, both his contemporaries and later scholars have agreed that history might have been different. He would have had carte blanche for at least the next few months after his recovery, and the world had religiously followed every news report on his health, and during the period when he could still work after the shooting, Garfield considered initiatives to address racial inequality and further honest government. It's entirely likely that in a full term, he would have proposed policies that we can barely imagine today. Of course, Garfield had his flaws, which almost every president does, but he sometimes moderated his positions in Congress out of political opportunism and was implicated in a banking scandal that involved corruption and financing the Union Pacific Railroad. And I don't seek to depict him as a heroic martyr, but only as an example of a political leader who genuinely wanted to do good things on a grand scale, but he was frustrated by his dreadful luck. If there were hopeful lessons to be drawn from the Garfield story, we have to look past its conclusion. Political wisdom suggested that the incumbent party, the most progressive one of the time, was doomed in the 1880 election, but Garfield defied that precedent through the sheer power of his personality, rhetoric, and idealism. But on a more pragmatic level, Republicans grasped that they didn't need to reinvent the wheel to overcome the hurdles of incumbency. They just had to motivate their most loyal sycophants and refuse to waver in the face of a bad faith attack by their opponents. Now, finally, the Garfield story is another reminder that the old adage about history repeating itself remains true. It's frustrating when that means the bad luck of the past can come back to bite us in the ass. But it is comforting because things can also get better if we keep the past visible in our rearview fucking mirror. So if you like the video, give the video a like and subscribe to my YouTube channel, RBW King, and also hit the notification bell so that you'll be notified when a new video comes out, and thanks for listening.